Hey everybody, if you've been following my sword videos for very long, you may have noticed that I've been trying to get a hold of various sword archetypes. So, modern replicas of swords that were historically significant, and one of those sword archetypes that I was really wanting to get a hold of was a scimitar. Now, when I thought of what a scimitar was, what I envisioned was something that looks like this curved, deep bellied sword with a falchion type point. But as I dug into that, I found out that that design it doesn't even seem to be historical. Matt Easton over at Schola Gladiatoria talks about that in relation to Morgan Freeman's sword in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and he doesn't seem to know either where that design comes from. So it seems to date back to the 20th century. If you search for it online, chances are you're going to find it referred to as a Sinbad scimitar. So it seems to kind of originate from Sinbad movies and popular culture from the 20th century. It could predate that, but I couldn't find any actual historical record of a sword that looked exactly like that, called a scimitar. The word scimitar is of debated origin. Some people say that it may have been French or Italian explorers from, I believe, the 16th century, and they referred to basically any non-Western curved sword as a scimitar. And this is where you can put your Skyrim, they have curved swords meme.
They've got curved swords. Curved swords.
That came to apply to a huge variety of swords, like the Turkish Klij, the Persian Shamshir, and the Indian Talwar. Some people believe it's a transliteration of the word Shamshir, but nevertheless, whenever I went looking for a good representation of a historical scimitar, well, there isn't really one particular sword. So I ended up picking up two, which I thought would be interesting to compare. The cold steel Indian Talwar and the Persian style Shamshir. What we have here is a sword with an overall length of 34 inches and a blade length of 29 inches and an advertised weight of 2.4 pounds. The blade is made of 1091 high carbon steel. Now the big feature, or the really noticeable feature on the Talwar, is this very large disc pommel. In this case, in the cold steel, and I believe that this is historical, the hilt is made of brass. The disc pommel is threaded, and from the pictures I've seen, this is threaded on and can be removed, and then there's a nut underneath, and that can be removed as well. When I first got this right out of the box, the hilt was a little loose. I ended up correcting that by just using this as basically wrench flats and tightening it down, but that did deform the brass a little bit. Now, my earliest feeling whenever I first started cutting with this sword was that I was going to hate it. That's the first thing that I thought, because I found it to be very uncomfortable to use the way that I was used to using one-handed swords. I was able to kind of cheat around that by wrapping my finger around the guard here, but that's not really how these swords are intended to be used. So I went and watched a bunch of videos, some Shamshir fighting, and some videos from Matt Easton at Schola Gladiatoria about how these are intended to be used. And really, what that disc pommel is intended to do is force you into a hammer grip, so that way you're using a very close-in fighting style that takes the best advantage of drawing cuts. And it's usually paired with a small shield that looks like a buckler called a dahl. Once I started to figure that out and get that down and made sure to keep my wrist very, very straight and also stand very close to the target, I was able to get really good consistent cuts. And over the course of about 2 hours of practice cutting with this sword, I really began to appreciate it and had a lot of fun learning a very different style of swordsmanship with this sword. Now, when this sword came to me, the edge was okay. It had a pretty steep angle on it, as do most cold steel swords, so I ended up taking that angle down a little bit, putting more of a convex grind to give it something more like a continuous grind, but got a nice sharp edge on it. It should be okay out of the box, or it seemed like it was going to be okay out of the box, but again, the edge is not quite up to snuff for what I prefer, the type of edge that I like, so I used a work sharp to make my own edge, basically. Now, I thought that this would be a good comparison between the Talwar and the Shamshir because they are similar swords. There are some differences that I'll get into here in a minute. The most obvious one, though, being the hilt style. This one is an overall length of 36 inches, which is slightly longer than the Talwar, and it has an advertised weight of only 1.8 pounds, so it's a fair bit lighter. The blade itself is 30 inches long and is made of 1055 high carbon steel. Now, the guard here is made of brass, which is pretty attractive. The grip is made of what they call faux buffalo horn. It feels like some kind of composite or plastic material. I don't particularly like the way it feels, but I think it looks okay, and it doesn't seem loose. It seems pretty solid. So I don't really have much complaint with it, other than I do wish that it was an organic material instead of a synthetic material. But that's fine. These swords aren't super expensive. I'll take what I can get. The grip is held on with 2 brass pins that you can see here, and everything is very tight and very snug on it. Now, the most pronounced difference, again, is the hilt, which is a lot more flexible than the Talwar. If you're used to holding a sword a particular way, you'll probably be able to figure out how to work your grip into the sword. So instead of having to work into the sword, you can make the sword work for you. So it's a little bit more flexible in that regard. From a cutting perspective, this also cut well. And actually the edge, the geometry was not quite as severe on this Shamshir as it was on the Talwar, but I still did end up polishing it up a little bit and taking a little bit of the secondary bevel down to give it more of a continuous edge. But right out of the box, this was one of the better cold steel edges that I've seen. Now, one of the other more pronounced differences between these two is you'll notice that the Talwar has a much heavier point, whereas the Shamshir tapers down quite a bit and has a fuller running up the length of the blade, almost the full length of the blade. Now, what's interesting is even though the Shamshir has quite a bit lighter advertised weight, the balance seems a lot further forward on it, which is possibly due to the longer length, almost certainly due to the longer length, but I've also noticed that the Talwar has a false edge on the back end of the blade where the Shamshir does not, and I think that the Talwar tapers a little bit more. So even though the Talwar is heavier, it actually balances better in the hand than the Shamshir. I'll try to show the Shamshir point of balance. You see it's quite far ahead of the guard compared to the Talwar, which is not far at all from the guard. So the Talwar, even though heavier, really does balance, in my opinion, a lot better, but you do lose some of the flexibility of the hilt if that's something you're going for. Overall, I think that these are really decent swords. Both of them have been really fun to use, and they've held up really well in cutting tests. So ultimately, it boils down to which of the styles you prefer, I think, if you were going to pick one to get. Now, one thing that I'll note as well is I reached out to Cold Steel about a different sword, and their response asking where Cold Steel swords are made was that all Cold Steel knives, they didn't say swords, they used the word knives, are made in Taiwan. Now, I could have sworn that either of these swords were made in India, and I don't remember where it said they were manufactured on in the box. But if they are currently being made in Taiwan, and if they were made in India, then that's something that could impact your experience with these swords. I'm not really sure. So something potentially to keep in mind is I may have a different country of origin and manufacture with these swords than what someone were to get, whoever sees this video going forward. So, but yeah, I'm pleased with both of these swords really quite a lot, especially for the price. I think they were both a smidge under $200 whenever I paid for them, $200 each. They also come with these pretty nice leather scabbards. I think they have some kind of plastic in the collar to keep them locked onto the sword tightly instead of it being wood core, which is fine. I mean, it works fine. It's definitely not historically accurate, but it works all right. But they are really ornate with this brass throat here, or brass collar here, and the brass chape that are really nicely carved and ornamented, and in general fit pretty well. This one's a little looser, and it's loosened up over time as I've used it. Well, I hope you liked the video. Please click like if you did. Be sure to subscribe to me if you haven't already. And I will see you again soon next time.